Thank you so much. I feel honored and privileged to present this afternoon. I battled with flu. In case I'm not very clear, I apologize. My talk is moving out of language boxes, and I'm going to argue for a pedagogy of integration. This is the outline for my talk. And I want to start with a quote, a linguist friend, Elana Shohami. She says, language is like life. There's an aspiration for order, for control, for possession, driven by fear of the unknown, of the powers and sources of evil. But there's always the reality that language, like life, cannot be controlled. All other kinds of control mechanisms, they do not work. Oops. So whatever that we do with language, trying to control it, it doesn't really work, because language is like life. Let me start by putting up front that multilingualism is often misconstrued as multiple unilingualisms. Okay? We've separated boundaries. These are hermetically sealed units. Okay? And this idea origins from the Eurocentric invented concept of language of the 1920s. For example, the work of von Humboldt, of one nation, one language. And then, of course, that cascade into one classroom, one language, under the pretext of nation building. Of course, you also use language to exclude other people at the same time. Then you had, throughout history, teachers becoming enslaved as boundary girders against cross-contamination of one language by the other. Okay? We know from the history of South African languages that they became casualties of what we call linguistic tribes through the Bantustan homeland system. Of course, as a sequel to the Afro-Balkanization of 1884. Right? Learning from that. But in the 21st century, we know that human identities are far much more complex than our narrow thinking about language. In this presentation, I'm going to make two very important claims. One, languages are embedded into one another. Here I'm going to move with what you call the social linguistics of mobility, that is not tied to space and time. It is language in motion, okay, as opposed to the variation is of space and a particular time. Okay? And language teachers need to build on these plural and mobile communicative repertoires that students bring with them into the classroom. Act 108 of 1996, of course, enshrined 11 official languages, but we know that in practice we have gravitated towards unilingualism. Okay? And of course, there were linguists who casted a shadow of doubt on those artificial constructions within our constitution, or what Magoni calls misinventions, which of course will result in monolingual perpetuation of monolingual practices. Right? What we see, therefore, is we have inherited monolithic practices. We maintain language immersion policies where children are immersed or assimilated into a unicultural orientation instead of the other way around. Children having to be socialized towards being multiple, not towards becoming unilingual. Okay? And of course, as we do that, because that's not the way in which they access information naturally, our schools are failing the children. You'll see with the dismal literacy rates, there are lots of problems with, of course, schooling, but I want to move that language and literacy is quite a big part of the story. If you think about this, you'll notice that this is what I call stupefaction of the children, because when they come in at grade 1, they're still relatively better off, and then as they go down, especially you'll notice between grade 4 and 3 and 4. That's why you have got this slump. And then out of that, they never recover. They're doomed, because this is the stage where habits need to be formed. They need to move more into concrete, abstract levels of thinking. Okay? And of course, the high school to university, the picture is so bleak. It's going very, very in unanticipated ways. And of course, our throughputs at universities is dismally low. Okay? Now, it is for this reason that I want to talk about translanguaging framework, where we need to move away from fixity to fluidity. Okay? Within translanguaging framework, we think that languages should not be viewed as separated systems that need to be placed in some kind of boxing or boxes, rather. And it accounts for heteroglossic situations where you can have one input in one language and then you have an output in a different language. Okay? Or other modes, if not language, could be visual and other ways. Therefore, we are very critical to notions such as first language, second language, additive, or diglossia, even for that matter, because all what they suggest is a sequential, linear way in which languages are acquired or used. Okay? And of course, they tend to favor monoglossic curriculum. The mode of operation here, you see speakers who grow up multilingually, they soft assemble. They have got a range of systems in their head, an expanded code from which they choose and pick at any point, depending on the social context as it demands. Okay? Slightly different from code switching, because code switching is really language-centered and not necessarily speaker-centered. In this model, we talk about centering whole communication from the point of view of the speaker. The story of indigenous African languages, and of course, learning English as a second language, they have got a challenge, which is to broaden their standard varieties to include forms that are not traditionally associated with them. They have been fixed, and therefore they are unable to move with times. Again, when it comes to English language classroom as well, you see this kind of boxing. These languages are not given space to infiltrate and to get in because of the nature of their multilingual orientation. Okay? Our methodologies are very, very dated. They're very less communicative and generally very monoglossic versus what you call the locus of plurality. That's what they bring into the classroom as a resource, the collective. Therefore, it's not surprising that you have this yawning disjuncture between permeable use in fluid multilingual settings versus the rigid classroom spaces. Okay? And of course, it's very difficult to develop any pedagogical framework for teaching African languages, for example, to speakers of other languages, as you have with English, for example, teaching English to speakers of other languages. Now, my question is, could translanguaging be an alternative for us in South Africa and elsewhere in multilingual contexts to develop biliteracy and multilingualism as a norm? I'm going to share with you one quick experiment in a Sepedi new language at the Wits School of Education. These are referred to as new language, newness in terms of literacy, and not necessarily that they are truly new, but they had not been exposed to reading and writing in that language. In fact, this is true for many, many South Africans. Even though we have 11 official languages, 9 indigenous African languages, we really have literacy in one of the languages because the school situation has only allowed you to learn and read only in your mother tongue and not in another language. So here we wanted to ensure that before the teachers get out of our system, they are ready for multilingual classrooms. They had to learn a language outside of their comfort zones. For example, if you are in the Nguni cluster, you cannot take another language in Nguni and vice versa, because we believe they are really mutually intelligible. Okay? So this is a Spedi class, but then Shitsong, isiZulu, isiXhosa, Swati, and Ndebele were allowed in the classroom without any problems. The course is more communicative. It uses functional notional syllabus where they have to do certain basic things with language, like giving directions, for example. The instructor's role explicitly calls for other languages to be used to explain certain concepts. For example, on the distinction between plurality versus when you show respect. How do you do that in your home language? Are they different? Are they similar? And then we do what is called contrastive elaboration, and they can move with that. Right? And of course, they have got multilingual blocks where they use Spedi and any other language in that block to talk, to reflect on their classrooms. Okay? Qualitative and quantitative means of going through the study were followed. I won't go into that. But these are some of the meta-languaging reflections. Okay? I realized that learning that the language reminds me of similar culture I have in my language. I can identify with Bapedi people better now. Okay? Identification with the target culture. Okay? That was not the intended consequence of the course, of course, but that's what you see. Now here you see that the course has affirmed what you call the collective or ubuntu worldview, okay? Because they saw exactly the same kind of thinking in the target language. Now here they have got ideas of wanting to continue further self-efficacy, okay? And the stigmas that are attached to not learning or using an African language in this case didn't really play out, right? Highly motivated. Okay, I went back. Mutual intelligibility. Now the interesting thing here is as they learned Sepedi in class, when they went outside, they realized that, by the way, speakers of Setswana and Sesotho, they could use the knowledge that they gained from class to expand their linguistic horizon, to talk, and they realized that, but I thought these languages were different, but I'm just talking like I'm okay, I'm accepted by these other speakers. In fact, Neville Alexander and Jacob Nhlabo educated South Africans about harmonization of mutually intelligible languages. In fact, what you see here is some kind of experiential harmonization where they actually feel it and use it, not just linguistic harmonization. Can we confirm this through numbers? Of course, yes, our experimental group generally outperformed your control group statistically significant ways, okay, when it comes to vocabulary development. Okay? And then oral reading proficiency, there isn't so much of a real big difference here, but of course the experimental group is still relatively a little bit higher. Okay? Of course, there's an explanation for this because they were not allowed, or they were not reading in these other languages, but only in one language. So what this is telling us, when they use one language, that's what you have. But overall, there has been a very, very significant, statistical significant gains in the experimental group on all the variables that were tested. Okay? Let me rush to the next experiment, which is experiment 2, reading literacy in English and Spedi in a primary school. The purpose of this project was to look at cognitive, contextual, and motivational conditions in which high-performing kids do. And the key here is outside of the phonological, graphological processing of high-frequent words, home and classroom literacy events were embedded, they were part of the course in both of the intervention, rather, in both languages. So we are borrowing this from a biliteracy model, the linguistic interdependence hypothesis, that bidirectional transfer of first language and second language reading skills, they can go either way, depends. Of course, Nancy Hornberger's biliteracy continua, which is an ecological point of view that breaks the boundary between reading and writing and first language and second language and other modes of communication. They continue side by side, they grow together. There's that possibility. The Matthew effect in reading trajectories, the poor shall be poor and the richer shall be richer. Those who have got poor reading skills in the beginning are likely to end that way as poor. And those who have got better reading skills. This also applies to two languages. If they have got better reading skills in English, they are likely to end up with better reading skills in English and not in home language. How do we offset this Matthew effect in terms of reading trajectory? Because we want to go for biliterate model and not uniliterate one. Okay, translanguaging approach was imposed into the classroom. Again, phonological awareness, we are doing reading and writing. I think this one is more interesting for me, where kids read in one language and they write in a different language and vice versa. So you have an input in one language and then you have an output in a different language. This is what you have, so we had to create multilingual print. You populate the classroom with first language and second language text. And the children begin to they use their own little pieces of writing. They can write love, they can use crayon, they can do anything. But the big story here is they're doing this one language and in the next language. You don't leave one language behind. Okay? And here, for example, when which is a title, and they have to retell the story. You own the story and you tell it in your own words. What was significant here, then they will change even the titles. What it means for them, it was Komaya Wahaka. It was all about the cultural orientation of the Wahaka people in Limpopo, but they thought Koma circumcision was the most dominant thing that they took out of the story, okay? Because that is probably what they can in the moment relate to. You have got text in English and they have to write this back also in their home language. In the end, this is what you have, a very mixed, rich print environment at the literacy corners in both languages. Home, great effect. Now the children got really highly motivated that they began to demand reading in any language, in English and in Sepedi in this particular case. This is grandmother has to listen every night now because the kids are fully charged. They want more books, they want to read, and they want to read for. One of the simple things that was done was you read 15 minutes before you sleep and read it to your mom, read it to your dad, or read it to anybody else in the house, or let them read for you if they can. And then here is a kid who really demanded the old woman had to go get her pension money in order to buy books. What does this tell us? To little rich, the textbook that they have were almost exhausted. They read everything and they wanted more text outside of school. And this is a book outside of school that the poor grandma had to go find. This little boy has got a very interesting story because what he does, he's an orphan, his mom died. I think he realized that when sick people are very sick, they tend to become lonely. So he picks up any book and he goes to any friend, anybody he knows is sick, and he just reads the book. Why are you doing this? Because I think they're lonely. Now you see literacy beginning to be used really to do something in the society. I think this is one of the classical cases. Can we support this by numbers? Of course, very much so. You see in the pre-test, the post-test results are remarkably significantly statistical significant. Of course, there was much more improvement in English than in their home language. Okay, and this I think is a great lesson for English teachers as well. That in fact, when you think you are doing African languages, you might incidentally be improving literacy rates in English as well. So it's not just a one language. Overall effect, that's fine, statistically significant, there's no problem with that. And I want to say that these few things before I step out. Both experiments question the validity of language boxing and monoglossic pedagogy in multilingual settings. Multilingual learners, we have learned, they shuttle between languages in non-conflictual but complementary ways. And this is what we mean by the trans language. Multilingualism is not monolingualism times 2 or times 11. Okay? Languages and literacies are permeable and they need to be socially embedded, what we call indexicality. Multiple identities reflected an expanded sense of self, okay? The ubuntu locus of being, right? Especially in the first experiment. Development of literacy requires a threshold in both languages, so you don't teach one language by that language when somebody is very multilingual, a resource that comes in there. Social outcome, income, significant gains in language literacy can be attributed to trans languages, I will claim. There were positive association with other languages and permeable cross-cultural ethos that are beyond discrete language units. I already spoke about experiential mutual intelligibility versus linguistic mutual intelligibility, or harmonization in the social intercomprehensibility. Balanced by literacy trajectories depend on us if we valorize discursive those social incomes, okay, as children, what they have already, instead of trying to invent or reduce. In conclusion, towards a plural vision, language is like life. Attempts to police it are simply futile. Monolithic strategies are not consonant with the realities of the 21st century. We need to be moving into social linguistics of mobility that is spatio-temporally complex. Teachers are called upon to allow multilingual spaces and antecedent genres and discursive resources learners bring with them to class. These social incomes ensure meaningful education and affirm identities of multilingual learners. Teachable translanguage strategies should be infused, in my view, in all multilingual or multicultural classrooms. This way we will diffuse the negative stereotypes that were traditionally associated with African languages and multilingualism as the tower of the Babel. Instead, we can recognize that multilingualism is a resource, in fact, a power of the Babel. More successful stories, of course, are needed so that we can clearly move into this pedagogy of integration. This is the power of the Babel. Thank you so much.